Excuse me. Brandon Holt didn't say it like a question. He said it like an order. He stood at the entrance of the first-class cabin, one hand gripping the overhead bin, the other holding his laptop bag, and then he swung it. Not placed it. Swung it across the empty seat in row 2, the leather corner catching the armrest with a hard crack that made the woman beside it look up from her book. She was black. She was calm. She had been there long before he arrived. Brandon looked her up and down once slowly, the way someone inspects something they've decided is out of place, then turned to the flight attendant with the flat confidence of a man who had never once been told no. "I need you to move her." Priya blinked. "Sir, I don't sit next to black women. Not for 4 hours. Not in a seat I paid $3,000 for." And he straightened his jacket, completely unbothered. "Find her something in the back. Coach, whatever you have. I don't care." Priya's mouth opened again. Brandon cut her off before a single word came out. "Actually," he tilted his head slightly, eyes sweeping over Dominique one more time, his lip curling at the corner. "Does she even belong in this cabin? Check her ticket. People like her usually wander in from the wrong section." A passenger in row 3 shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Nobody said anything. Dominique didn't move, didn't blink, kept her eyes on the window. Brandon pulled out his phone, already bored with the situation, already certain it would be handled. Then he glanced back one final time and smiled. A small, private smile, the kind that doesn't need an audience. "I've worked my whole career to sit in seats like this," he said almost to himself, almost amused. "I'm not spending 4 hours breathing the same air as someone who got here by accident." The cabin went absolutely still, not quiet still. The kind of stillness where people stop chewing, stop scrolling, stop pretending they aren't listening. The woman in seat 2A closed her book, slowly, deliberately. She didn't look at him. She looked out the window at the flat gray Chicago sky, and she said absolutely nothing. What Brandon Holt didn't know, standing there in his certainty, in his pressed suit, in the unchallenged comfort of a man who had spent 48 years being handed exactly what he demanded, was that the black woman he had just tried to relocate, like a piece of misplaced luggage, owned 85% of the company that signed every paycheck he had ever received. This is that story, and it does not end the way he expected. Stay with me, because the moment the truth comes out, you will feel it in your chest like a punch. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it now, because what happens in that conference room will leave you completely breathless. To understand what happened on that flight, you have to understand who Dominique Reeves actually was. Not who Brandon Holt assumed she was. Not the version of her that fit neatly inside his prejudice. The real woman. The one who had been sitting in that seat long before he arrived, reading a report with a yellow highlighter tucked behind her ear and a half-finished coffee balanced on the tray table. Dominique Reeves was 41 years old. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom row house in East Baltimore, the kind of neighborhood where the corner stores had bulletproof glass at the register and the school buses ran late every single morning. Her father, Gerald Reeves, had worked for the United States Postal Service for 31 years. He drove the same route 5 days a week, never called in sick, never complained, and came home every evening smelling like ink and cold air. He used to tell Dominique the same thing at the dinner table, quietly, without drama, the way people say things they genuinely believe. You do the work. You do it right. The rest takes care of itself. Dominique had carried those words like a second spine through every year of her life that followed. She had graduated from Morgan State University at 22 with a degree in finance and $11,000 in student loan debt. She had worked her first job as a junior analyst at a regional investment firm in Maryland, sharing an apartment with 2 other women and eating rice and beans 4 nights a week to make her rent. She learned the business from the floor up, not from a corner office. not from a family connection. From 12-hour days and weekends and the particular education that comes from being the only black woman in every room you walk into and deciding every single morning that you will be so good they cannot ignore you. At 27, she had borrowed $12,000 from her father's retirement savings, a fact that kept her awake at night for 2 full years, and founded Hartwell Capital Group out of a rented office in downtown Chicago that was barely large enough to hold a desk and a filing cabinet. 14 years later, Hartwell Capital managed $4.2 billion in assets. They had offices in 8 cities, 1,200 employees, a reputation in the industry for rigorous ethics, disciplined strategy, and a company culture that people actually stayed for. Dominique owned 85% of it. She did not travel with assistants. She did not take the company car to the airport. She carried her own bag, a simple black carry-on she had owned for 6 years, and she flew commercial, always, even when the board suggested otherwise. She had explained her reasoning to Sandra Cole, her general counsel, exactly once. The day I stop moving through the world, the way regular people do, is the day I stop understanding what I'm actually building this for. Sandra had stopped arguing after that. On the morning of October 14th, Dominique had arrived at Chicago O'Hare at 6:45 for the 7:50 flight to JFK. She was traveling alone. She had a board presentation in New York the following afternoon, and 3 acquisition documents she needed to finish reviewing before then. She had checked in at the gate, accepted a last-minute upgrade to first class that the gate agent offered because the economy cabin was oversold, and settled into seat 2A without giving it a second thought. She had opened her folder, uncapped her highlighter, and begun to read. That was where Brandon Holt found her 20 minutes later. Brandon Holt had been with Hartwell Capital for 14 years, hired the same year Dominique founded the company back when Hartwell was still small enough that everybody knew everybody's name. He had come in as a mid-level acquisitions analyst with a University of Chicago MBA, a firm handshake, and the kind of easy confidence that rooms full of investors tended to respond well to. He was good at his job. That part was true and worth saying plainly. He understood deal structure. He could read a room. He knew how to close. What he was less good at, what he had never once been asked to examine, was what happened to the people around him when the room stopped watching. Over 14 years, Brandon Holt had risen to Senior Vice President of Acquisitions. He managed a team of 22 people. He presented strategies at board meetings that he had in several cases inherited wholesale from junior analysts who would never receive credit for them. He had a corner office on the 47th floor with a view of Lake Michigan. He earned $340,000 a year, plus performance bonuses. He had met Dominique Reeves exactly twice, both times at large company events where she had been pointed out to him from across the room. He had not introduced himself either time. He had not thought much about her at all, the way powerful people sometimes don't think about the source of their power. He boarded the flight that morning running 4 minutes late. His phone pressed to his ear, finishing a call with Kevin Marsh, his VP of Finance, about the acquisition presentation scheduled for tomorrow. "I'll walk them through the Chicago model first," Brandon said into the phone as he entered the jetway. "Then pivot to the Portland numbers. It'll land well." Kevin's voice came back flat and agreeable, the way Kevin's voice always came back. "Sounds right. You want me to adjust the slide order?" "No, leave it. I'll handle it." He ended the call as he stepped through the cabin door, tucked his phone into his breast pocket, and looked down the aisle toward his row. He saw her immediately. Something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of something fast and ugly. And then his jaw set, and he reached for his laptop bag and he swung it across the empty seat in row 2. And the story began. Priya Anand had been a flight attendant for 12 years. She had handled medical emergencies at 30,000 feet. She had talked panicking passengers through turbulence so severe the overhead bins cracked open. She had dealt with drunk businessmen and crying children, and a man who once tried to open an emergency exit over the Pacific Ocean because he was, in his own words, just curious. She thought she had seen everything the job could produce. She had not seen anything quite like Brandon Holt standing in the aisle of row 2, arms crossed, waiting for her to solve a problem that was not a problem. "Sir," she said carefully, "the way you speak to something unstable. Can I see your boarding pass?" Brandon produced it without looking at her, his eyes still moving around the cabin with the slow, measuring quality of someone conducting a private assessment. Priya looked at the pass. Seat 2B. She looked at Dominique. Seat 2A. She looked back at Brandon. "Sir, your seat is 2B. The window seat is assigned to this passenger. Everything appears to be in order." "That's not what I asked you," Brandon said. His voice was pleasant in the way that some voices are pleasant specifically to make the person receiving them feel small. "I asked you to move her. Those are two different things." Dominique turned a page of her document. She did not look up. "Sir, I'm not able to reassign a passenger who has a valid boarding pass for her seat. Then find me a different seat. First class is fully booked this morning. There are no..." "Then bump someone from business." Brandon finally looked directly at Priya, and his expression was patient in the most condescending way possible, the expression of a man explaining something obvious to someone he has already decided is slow. "I travel this route 11 times a year. I am a Platinum Elite member. I spend more money with this airline in a single quarter than most people spend in a decade. And I am telling you clearly and calmly that I will not be sitting next to her." The cabin had gone quiet in that gradual, unmistakable way, the way background noise disappears when something real is happening. Conversations softened. Music earbuds came out. People found reasons to look toward row 2. Brandon seemed to notice. And instead of lowering his voice, he raised it. He turned slowly, deliberately, and looked at the passengers in rows 3 and 4. 2 men in business attire, a woman reading a novel, a couple sharing a tablet. "Does anyone else find this uncomfortable?" His voice was almost conversational, almost reasonable. Almost. "I can't be the only one. We paid for this cabin. We have a right to feel at ease." The silence that followed was the worst kind of silence. Not the silence of disagreement. The silence of people deciding in real time that this was not their problem to solve. The man in 3A looked down at his newspaper. The woman with the novel turned a page she had not read. The couple with the tablet tilted the screen slightly away, as if adjusting the angle would place them outside the situation entirely. Nobody said a word. Across the aisle in seat 3B, a man named Marcus Drew set down his coffee cup, very quietly reached into his jacket pocket, and pressed record on his phone. He rested it against the tray table at a natural angle lens facing forward, and did not move. Dominique still had not looked up from her document. Her highlighter moved across a line of text. Her breathing was even. Whatever she was feeling, and there were layers of it compressed and controlled behind years of practice, none of it reached her face. Brandon turned back to Priya. "Last chance," he said simply. Priya straightened her spine by a fraction. Her voice, when it came, was professional and careful, and cost her something to produce. "Sir, I am not able to remove a passenger from a validly assigned seat. I can offer you..." "You know what?" Brandon reached into the overhead bin and pulled out his laptop bag, setting it on the seat with a finality that said the conversation was over. "I'll stand in the galley for the whole flight if I have to. I will file a complaint with your supervisor, with the airline, with the Department of Transportation, if it comes to that." He looked at Priya with an expression of polite, implacable contempt. "And when I do, I'll make sure everyone knows that your crew refused to accommodate a platinum elite passenger with a simple, reasonable request. He said the word simple the way people say it when they know perfectly well that what they're asking for is not simple at all. Priya turned to Dominique. Her eyes carried an apology that her professional position would not allow her to say out loud. "Ma'am, I apologize for this situation. If you're willing, we do have an available premium seat at the front of the cabin. I want to make sure you're comfortable for the flight." Dominique looked up from her document for the first time since Brandon had arrived. She looked at Priya, not at Brandon, not at the passengers who had said nothing, not at the phone recording from 3B, just at Priya. And in her expression there was something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite resignation, but something older and heavier than either. "Thank you, Priya," she said quietly. She capped her highlighter. She gathered her documents. She picked up her coffee cup and her carry-on with the unhurried movements of a woman who had decided a long time ago that she would not let moments like this make her less than she was. She walked toward the front of the cabin without looking back. Brandon watched her go, and then he settled into his seat, ordered a whiskey, before they'd even pushed back from the gate, and smiled the small, private smile of a man who believed he had won. 2 rows back, James Whitfield had not moved, had not spoken, had not looked away from the aisle for a single second. His face was completely unreadable, but his hands resting on his knees were pressed together so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale. At 35,000 feet, the world below becomes abstract. Cities shrink to grids of light. Highways become thin silver threads. Problems that felt enormous on the ground take on a different quality up in that blue-gray silence, smaller sometimes, or at least farther away. Brandon Holt leaned back in his reclined seat and felt for the first time that morning genuinely relaxed. The whiskey helped. So did the legroom. So did the particular satisfaction of a situation resolved on his terms, the way situations in Brandon's experience generally were resolved when he applied sufficient pressure. He had already stopped thinking about the woman he had displaced. She was a footnote now, an inconvenience handled and forgotten, the way a man like Brandon handled and forgot 100 small inconveniences every week. He pulled up the acquisition presentation on his laptop and scrolled through the slides, making small adjustments, tightening language, replacing one chart with a version that made the Chicago numbers look slightly more favorable. Tomorrow's board meeting would go well. It always went well when Brandon was presenting. The slides, if anyone had looked closely, were built on a framework that Dominique Reeves had spent 3 weeks designing. Brandon had received it as a forwarded internal document from a junior analyst who hadn't known any better. He had read it, recognized immediately that it was exceptional, and quietly incorporated it into his own presentation without a single word of attribution. This was not the first time he had done something like this. It would not, he had assumed, be the last. He scrolled to slide 14 and took another sip of whiskey. 2 rows behind him, Kevin Marsh was doing what Kevin Marsh did best on flights, avoiding eye contact with everyone, eating the complimentary mixed nuts, with the focused attention of a man performing a task, and waiting for the situation he had witnessed at the gate to fully recede from his immediate vicinity. Kevin had said nothing during the confrontation. He was good at saying nothing during confrontations. It was in many ways the skill that had kept him employed under Brandon for 6 years. He knew in the private part of himself that he rarely examined directly that what he had watched in that aisle was wrong. He also knew in the same private part that he would not be the one to say so. He ate another cashew and watched a movie he would not remember by the time they landed. 3 rows ahead of Brandon in the premium seat that Priya had offered her, Dominique Reeves was working. She had her document folder open in her lap, and a second folder, the acquisition file, spread across the tray table. She was reviewing numbers she already knew, checking them anyway, the way she always checked everything she already knew, because the habit of verification was the habit that had kept her from making costly mistakes for 14 years. She was also quietly listening, not deliberately, not with any particular intention. She had simply been aware since childhood of the specific skill of absorbing information from a room without appearing to absorb information from a room. It was a skill that Black women in professional spaces developed the way other people developed typing, speed out of necessity through repetition, because the cost of being caught off guard was always higher for them than for the people around them. The two voices she was listening to belonged to the men in the row directly behind her. She recognized one of them, Robert Elias Hartwell's Director of Institutional Partnerships, a careful, methodical man who had been with the company for 9 years and who had, to Dominique's knowledge, never once said anything in a board meeting that he hadn't already cleared with someone more senior. The other voice she didn't recognize immediately. Lower. More careful. The voice of someone who had learned to conduct sensitive conversations in public by keeping the volume just below the threshold of obvious. "The board meeting tomorrow is going to be interesting," Robert said. His tone had the particular quality of a man trying to sound casual about something that was not casual at all. "You heard about the audit." "Heard about it," the second voice confirmed. "Didn't know it had gone this far. Further than anyone expected. She's been reviewing personnel records personally, not through legal, not through HR personally." A brief silence. "How far back?" 6 years. Another silence. Longer this time. "That covers Holt's entire VP tenure." "Yes," Robert said. "It does." Dominique turned a page of her document. Her highlighter did not move. "I'll tell you something else." The second voice continued, quieter now. "I've been at this company for 11 years. Never once seen her travel with the executive team. Never once seen her at an airport lounge, never seen her on the company jet. You know what people say about her?" A pause. "You could sit next to Dominique Reeves on a commercial flight and not know it was her. She doesn't look the part." Robert made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite agreement. "She built the part," he said simply. "She just doesn't perform it." The conversation moved on to other things. Dominique filed away every word of it with the same methodical attention she applied to acquisition documents and board presentations and the $12,000 loan her father had given her when she was 27 years old and terrified and completely certain she was going to make it anyway. The plane descended into JFK an hour and 40 minutes later. At the baggage carousel in the fluorescent noise of Terminal 4, arrivals, a hand touched her elbow lightly. "Ms. Reeves." She turned. James Whitfield stood behind her, his gray overcoat still buttoned, his carry-on at his feet. He was 63 years old, a Hartwell board member for 8 years, and one of 4 people in the company who knew the full scope of what Dominique had been building in her private audit over the past 4 months. His face was controlled, but his eyes were not. "I was on that flight," he said. "I saw everything." "I know James," Dominique said. He looked at her for a moment. "Are you going to do something about it?" Dominique reached forward and pulled her carry-on from the belt. She zipped the front pocket closed. She settled the strap over her shoulder. "I already am," she said, and she walked toward the exit without looking back. The 47th floor of Hartwell Capital's Manhattan headquarters smelled like fresh coffee and expensive ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the eastern wall, offering an unobstructed view of Midtown that senior staff had long since stopped noticing. The carpet was charcoal gray. The conference tables were tempered glass. The art on the walls had been selected by a firm that charged more per piece than most people earned in a year. Brandon Holt walked through the main corridor at 8:47 the following morning, nodding at the two analysts who scrambled to look busy as he passed, dropping his coat on his assistant's desk without breaking stride, and pushing open the door to the large briefing room where his team had already assembled for the pre-board run-through. 8 people around the table, young mostly, eager in the way junior staff at firms like Hartwell tended to be eager carefully, strategically, with one eye always on who was watching. At the far end of the table in the second-to-last chair sat Teresa Banks. She was 34 years old, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she pushed up her nose when she was concentrating. She had joined Hartwell 6 years ago as a financial analyst and had within 3 years built a reputation in the acquisitions department for a particular kind of thinking, the kind that connected data points other people missed, that found the structural weakness in a deal before the deal ever reached the table. Her performance reviews had used words like exceptional and rare, and a genuine asset to the team. Then she had filed a complaint against Brandon Holt 18 months ago, and then very quickly those words had stopped appearing in her reviews. She watched Brandon take his position at the head of the table and clicked to the first slide of his presentation. It was Dominique's framework. Teresa recognized it immediately. She had seen the original document circulating as an internal forward 3 weeks ago, had read it carefully, and thought to herself, this is the best acquisition model this company has produced in 5 years. Now it was on Brandon's slide deck, with Brandon's name in the footer, and Brandon's voice narrating the logic as if the ideas had emerged fully formed from his own mind. Teresa pushed her glasses up her nose and wrote nothing on her notepad. Brandon moved through the slides with the polished fluency of someone who had been performing competence for so long that the performance and the reality had become indistinguishable even to himself. He paused at slide 9, the Chicago market analysis, and tapped the screen with his laser pointer. This is where we close the argument, he said. The Portland numbers support the entry point, but Chicago is the anchor. If the board pushes back on timing, we go here and we hold. Heads around the table nodded. Kevin Marsh, seated 2 chairs to Brandon's left, nodded with slightly more enthusiasm than the others, the way a person nods when they are trying to make up for something they cannot name. Teresa did not nod. She looked at slide 9 and thought about the night she had spent at her kitchen table 18 months ago writing a 4-page complaint, with her hands shaking and her jaw set, documenting every instance of blocked promotion, every reassigned project, every meeting she had been excluded from without explanation, every time Brandon had taken her work and walked it into a room she was not allowed to enter. She had filed the complaint with HR on a Tuesday morning in April. Patricia Voss, Hartwell's Director of Human Resources, had called her into a meeting 3 days later. The meeting had lasted 11 minutes. Patricia had used phrases like perception management and team dynamics, and perhaps a different framing would serve you better here. She had not taken a single note. She had not opened Teresa's complaint document once during the entire 11 minutes. What Teresa did not know, what she would not learn until much later, was that Patricia Voss had called Brandon Holt before that meeting even happened. The call had lasted 4 minutes and 22 seconds. It had been automatically recorded as all internal calls at Hartwell were recorded by the compliance system that Brandon himself had signed off on in 2019 as a measure to protect the company from litigation exposure. Patricia's voice on the recording was relaxed and almost friendly. Just so you know, she filed. But don't worry, I've seen worse. This won't go anywhere. Brandon's response had been 2 words. Good. Thanks. Teresa had resigned 8 months after the complaint. She had lost her health insurance the same day her termination processed. For 11 months, she had worked a retail position at a home goods store in Brooklyn, folding towels and running the register, and trying not to calculate what she should have been earning. She had paid for her asthma medication out of pocket, rationing the doses in the months when the cost and the rent fell on the same week. She had told herself during those 11 months that she was done with Hartwell Capital. Done with that building, that carpet, that view of Midtown that she had once believed she was working toward. She was back now because Sandra Cole had called her 4 days ago and asked her to come in as a consultant on a documentation review project. Sandra had not explained the full scope of the project over the phone. She had simply said, in the calm and precise way that Sandra said most things, "I think you'll want to be part of this, Teresa." Teresa had said yes before Sandra finished the sentence. The briefing room door opened. Brandon's assistant leaned in slightly breathless. "Sorry to interrupt. Mr. Holt, there's a calendar update. Your 3 o'clock has been moved to conference room A and marked mandatory attendance." Brandon glanced up from his laptop. "Who called it?" "Ms. Cole's office." Brandon paused for half a second. "Fine. Send the confirmation." He turned back to his slides. He did not ask who Sandra Cole was. He assumed with the comfortable certainty of a man who had spent 14 years assuming things correctly that it was a routine legal check-in. Something administrative. Something that would take 30 minutes and resolve itself without requiring his full attention. He straightened his collar and moved to the next slide. Across the table, Teresa Banks looked down at her notepad. She wrote one line slowly and deliberately, and then she underlined it twice. She did not show it to anyone. Sandra Cole had been practicing corporate law for 19 years. She had worked at 2 of the largest firms in the country before Dominique hired her away at a salary that reflected what Dominique actually thought she was worth, which was considerably more than either firm had been paying her. Sandra was 46, precise in the way that people who grew up without margin for error tend to be precise, and she had a particular gift for constructing arguments that felt inevitable, the kind where by the time you reached the conclusion, you couldn't imagine how you had ever believed anything else. She arrived at conference room A at 2:58 with a black briefcase, a leather portfolio, and 2 federal investigators she introduced only as colleagues from the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. She did not explain further. She set her briefcase on the table, opened it, and began laying documents out in a sequence that she had spent 4 days determining. The sequence that would produce maximum comprehension with minimum opportunity for deflection. The documents told a story. It was not a complicated story. It was, in fact, a very simple one, the kind that only looks complicated because the people responsible for it had spent years wrapping it in the language of performance management and corporate policy and business necessity. Strip that language away, and what remained was plain enough. 23 formal complaints filed against Brandon Holt over 6 years, 19 of them involving employees of color. Every single one of them buried by HR before reaching the review stage. The pattern was consistent to a degree that Sandra had described to Dominique, in the privacy of their first meeting on the subject, as almost elegant in its predictability. Employees would file. Patricia Voss would log the filing. Patricia Voss would call Brandon. The complaint would be classified as resolved through internal discussion. No investigation. No documentation, no follow-up. Within 6 months of filing in 16 of the 23 cases, the employee in question had either resigned or been terminated. The bonus fund records were worse. Brandon managed a departmental budget that included a discretionary performance bonus pool, $380,000 annually, distributed at his direct authority to team members based on his own evaluations. Sandra's forensic accountant had spent 2 weeks reconstructing 5 years of distributions. The findings were specific and damning. Over 5 years, employees of color in Brandon's department had received an average of 31% less in discretionary bonuses than their white counterparts with equivalent or superior performance ratings. The total redirected amount across 5 years was $180,000. And then there was the December 31st edit. Sandra had found it during a routine audit of the HR system's change logs, a feature of the software that most users didn't know existed, that recorded every modification made to any employee file, including the timestamp, the user credentials, and the original value before the change. Brandon had apparently not known it existed either. On December 31st, at 11:47 in the evening, Brandon's credentials had been used to access Teresa Banks's annual performance file. Her rating had been changed from exceeds expectations to needs improvement. The change had been made 3 days after the formal response window closed, meaning Teresa had no mechanism to dispute it. The altered rating had formed the documented basis for her termination 8 weeks later. Sandra placed the change log printout at the center of the table and looked at it for a moment before continuing. At 4.2 million views, and climbing, Marcus Drew's recording had done something that Sandra's documents alone could not. It had given the story a face. A specific, unambiguous face. Brandon's voice in the video was clear and unhurried. The voice of a man who felt no need to modulate himself because he did not believe there were consequences. The comment sections across every platform where the video had spread were by Wednesday afternoon producing a volume of response that Hartwell's communications team had described in an internal memo as a reputational event of significant magnitude. The stock had dropped 4% by noon. 3 institutional investors had called the board directly. A journalist at a major business publication had emailed Hartwell's press office requesting comment on allegations of systemic discrimination within the acquisitions division. At 2:45, 15 minutes before Sandra's meeting, Brandon had called a contact in HR. The call had been brief. His voice on the recording was clipped and controlled, the voice of a man who believed he was being careful. "I need you to flag anything that comes in under my name today. Anything. Kill it before it reaches the second level." A pause. Then the contact's voice, uncertain. "Brandon, I don't think I can. I'm not asking you to think about it. I'm asking you to do it." The call ended. The compliance system logged it at 2:47, 18 minutes, before Brandon walked into conference room A and found Sandra Cole and 2 federal investigators waiting for him with 19 months of evidence arranged on a table. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes moved across the room, the documents, the investigators. Sandra's expression, which was not hostile and not sympathetic, and contained absolutely no ambiguity about what was happening. He said nothing for a long moment. Then Sandra slid a single photograph across the table toward him. A clear, well-lit image captured from Marcus Drew's recording. Brandon in the aisle of row 2, smirking, his hand resting on the laptop bag he had thrown across the empty seat. Dominique visible in her peripheral seat, eyes on the window. "Mr. Holt," Sandra said. She let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds before she spoke again. "Do you know who was sitting in seat 2A? Brandon's face went the color of old paper. The silence in conference room A had a particular quality to it. Not the silence of a room where nothing was happening. The silence of a room where everything had already happened, and the person who needed to understand that most was the last one to arrive at the understanding. Brandon Holt stood at the head of the table and looked at the photograph and did not move. Sandra did not rush him. She had learned over 19 years of this work that the moment immediately after revelation was its own form of evidence. What people did in that moment, how they breathed, where their eyes went, what their hands did, told you more about them than anything they would say afterward. Brandon's hands went still at his sides. His eyes stayed on the photograph for 4 full seconds. Then they moved slowly, the way eyes move when the mind is working very fast and the body is trying very hard not to show it to the documents spread across the table. To the federal investigators who had not introduced themselves and had not needed to. To Sandra's face, which gave him nothing. "I'd like to call my lawyer," he said. Of course, Sandra said. You're not under arrest. You're free to make any call you'd like. But I want to make sure you understand what's in front of you before you do, because I think it will affect the conversation you're about to have. She pulled the chair at the near end of the table out and gestured to it. Not aggressively, simply. The way you gesture to a chair when you are conducting a meeting that you are entirely in control of. Brandon sat down. Sandra turned her laptop to face him and pressed play. The video filled the screen. The first-class cabin, the overhead bins, the gray leather seats. Brandon's voice, clear and unhurried, filling the conference room with the words he had spoken 48 hours ago over the city of Chicago at 35,000 feet. I don't sit next to black women. Not for 4 hours. Not in a seat I paid $3,000 for. Brandon looked at the table. Does anyone else find this uncomfortable? I can't be the only one. Somewhere outside the conference room, a phone rang twice and stopped. I've worked my whole career to sit in seats like this. I'm not spending 4 hours breathing the same air as someone who got here by accident. Sandra closed the laptop. The woman in seat 2A, she said, is Dominique Reeves, founder of Hartwell Capital Group. She owns 85% of this company. She has been your employer in every legal and structural sense of that word for 14 years. The room waited. Brandon's jaw moved once, twice. The expression on his face cycled through several things, quickly disbelief, calculation, something that was close to fear but had not quite arrived there yet, and then settled into something controlled and careful. I didn't recognize her, he said. I know, Sandra said. If I had known who she was, you didn't need to know who she was. Sandra's voice did not change pitch or volume. It simply became somehow more present. She was a human being in a seat she had paid for. That was sufficient. Brandon opened his mouth, closed it. Sandra turned to the next set of documents. Mr. Holt, the video is not the primary subject of today's meeting. The video is context. What I'd like to walk you through now is 6 years of personnel records from your department. She talked for 22 minutes. She did not editorialize. She did not raise her voice. She laid each document down in sequence and described its contents with the flat, specific precision of someone who had spent 4 months making sure that every number was correct and every conclusion was airtight. 23 complaints. 19 involving employees of color. Everyone buried before reaching review. The bonus fund. 5 years of distributions. $180,000 redirected away from minority staff through manipulated performance metrics. The December 31st edit. Teresa Banks's file. 11:47 in the evening. The changed rating. The closed response window. The termination that followed. When she finished, the room was so quiet that the hum of the building's HVAC system was audible. Then a video call connected on the conference room screen. James Whitfield's face appeared composed, gray at the temples, the face of a man who had made a decision and was at peace with it. Brandon, James said. Just the name. Nothing else. Brandon looked at the screen. Something in his face finally gave way, not dramatically, not with any visible collapse, but in the small specific way that faces give way when the last exit closes. Kevin Marsh had been contacted separately. Sandra informed Brandon at 2:15 that afternoon. Kevin had provided a full written statement by 2:40. Kevin's lawyer had recommended cooperation. Kevin had not required significant persuasion. Brandon looked at the documents, at Sandra, at James on the screen. I want my lawyer, he said again. Absolutely, Sandra said. Make the call. He reached for his phone. His hand was not steady. He was still dialing when the conference room door opened. No knock. No assistant announcing anyone. The door simply opened the way doors open when the person on the other side has decided that the formality of knocking no longer applies to this particular room. Dominique Reeves walked in. She was wearing the same clothes she had worn on the flight, the same simple jacket, the same carry-on strap over her shoulder, as if she had come directly from somewhere else and this stop had always been on her itinerary. She looked at Brandon Holt with the same expression she had worn when he threw his laptop bag across the seat beside her. Calm, contained, entirely, utterly present. The room went absolutely still. Nobody breathed. Dominique pulled out the chair at the head of the table, her table in her building, in the company that bore the name she had chosen when she was 27 years old, and terrified and certain, and she sat down. She folded her hands in front of her, and she looked at him. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a phone or a pen or a glass of water. The two federal investigators who had between them conducted hundreds of depositions and sat through proceedings that had made experienced attorneys go pale did not move either. Dominique Reeves sat at the head of the table and looked at Brandon Holt and said nothing for a long moment. Not because she was gathering herself. She had gathered herself 14 years ago and had not come undone since. She was quiet because she had learned over a lifetime of being in rooms where people underestimated her. That silence was frequently the most powerful thing a person could deploy. Brandon's lawyer had not yet arrived. His phone sat face down on the table in front of him. His hands were clasped together so tightly that the skin across his knuckles had gone pale and smooth. Dominique unzipped the front pocket of her carry-on and removed a single folder. She placed it on the table in front of her without opening it. She did not need to open it. She had read everything inside it so many times over the past 4 months that she could have recited it from memory in the dark. "Mr. Holt," she said. Her voice was even, not warm, not cold. Even the way a foundation is even the way a level surface is even with no variation and no give. "I'm going to say some things to you, and I'd like you to listen without interrupting. Not because I need your silence, because I think for once in your career at this company, it would serve you to actually hear what someone is telling you." Brandon said nothing. Whatever calculation was still running behind his eyes, it had apparently determined that silence was the correct output for this particular moment. Dominique opened the folder. "I built Hartwell Capital because I believed that a company could be both excellent and decent. That those two things were not in conflict. That you could build something rigorous and demanding and also treat the people inside it with dignity." She paused. "I have held on to that belief through 14 years of evidence that suggested in certain corners of this organization I was wrong." She placed the first document on the table. Teresa Banks's original performance reviews. 5 years of exceptional and outstanding and genuine asset to the team. Teresa Banks joined this company 6 years ago. Her first 3 years of reviews describe one of the strongest analytical minds her managers had ever worked with. "I read those reviews 4 months ago, and I thought that is exactly the kind of person Hartwell Capital exists to develop." She placed the second document beside the first. The complaint filing, the HR log, the call record between Patricia Voss and Brandon 4 minutes and 22 seconds, 2 days before Teresa's meeting with HR. Brandon looked at the call record. A muscle in his jaw moved once. "She filed a complaint," Dominique continued. "A formal, documented, specific complaint. And within 48 hours, your HR director called you to tell you it would disappear. And it did." She placed the December 31st changelog in front of him. The timestamp. 11:47 p.m. The altered rating. The closed response window. "New Year's Eve," Dominique said quietly. 11:47 at night. You waited until the last possible moment in the last possible window of the year after the deadline for employee response had passed, and you changed her rating from exceeds expectations to needs improvement. She looked at him directly. That is not a bad decision made under pressure. That is a plan. The room was absolutely still. She lost her job 8 weeks later. She lost her health insurance the same day. She worked retail for 11 months. She rationed her asthma medication. Brandon's lawyer chose that moment to knock and open the conference room door. He was a tall man in a charcoal suit, carrying a briefcase, wearing the expression of someone who had been briefed quickly in a hallway and was still assembling the full picture. He stopped when he saw Dominique at the head of the table. He looked at Sandra. Sandra looked back at him with an expression that communicated efficiently and without hostility that he was welcome to sit down, but that the proceedings would not be paused for his arrival. He sat down. Dominique did not acknowledge the interruption. She turned to the bonus fund records. $180,000, she said. Over 5 years, taken through falsified performance metrics from the bonuses of employees of color in your department and redistributed to others. She closed the folder. I want you to understand something, Mr. Holt. I am not angry at you for not recognizing me on that plane. Brandon looked up. I am ending your career at this company because of what you did when you thought it didn't matter. Because of what you did to 23 people who filed complaints and were silenced. Because of what you did to Teresa Banks at 11:47 on New Year's Eve when the building was empty and you believed no one was watching. She paused. Someone was always watching. The system you approved in 2019 was watching. The change logs were watching. The compliance recordings were watching. A beat. I was watching. On the conference room screen, James Whitfield had not moved. The 2 federal investigators were writing. Brandon's lawyer leaned toward his client and whispered something brief and urgent. Brandon did not appear to hear it. He was looking at Dominique with an expression that had finally completely shed every layer of calculation and performance and arrived at something unguarded and raw. He looked for the first time like a man who understood the full weight of what he had done. Dominique stood. She picked up her folder. She settled the carry-on strap over her shoulder with the unhurried movements of a woman with somewhere else to be. Mr. Holt, she said, you have until end of business today to clear your office. She looked at Sandra. Sandra nodded once. Dominique walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame, not turning back, speaking to the room in the same even voice she had used throughout. Teresa Banks will be contacted this afternoon, she said. Make sure legal has the reinstatement paperwork ready before 5. She walked out. The door closed behind her without a sound. The company-wide email went out at 4:57 p.m., 3 minutes before end of business. It came from Dominique Reeves's direct address, not the communications team, not a PR. Softened statement, drafted by committee, not a carefully worded memo designed to say as little as possible while appearing to say something meaningful. It came from her, in her voice, with her name at the bottom. The subject line read, a message about accountability at Hartwell Capital. 1,200 employees across 8 offices opened it within the first 11 minutes. Dominique had written it herself in the 2 hours between leaving conference room A and the send time in the quiet of her corner office with the door closed and the city spread out below her windows in the late afternoon light. She had written 4 drafts. The first 3 were too long. The 4th was exactly what it needed to be. She told them what had happened on the flight. Not the version that required interpretation, or context, or careful reading between lines. The direct version plainly stated the way her father used to state plain things at the dinner table when she was growing up. This is what happened. This is what it means. This is what we're going to do about it. She told them about the 23 complaints. She told them about the buried files and the falsified performance records and the $180,000. She told them about Teresa Banks, not by name initially, with Teresa's permission obtained that afternoon, before the email was drafted, and then with full name and full detail after Teresa said quietly and without hesitation, "Use my name. I want people to know." She told them that Brandon Holt had been terminated effective immediately, with all benefits and bonuses revoked on grounds of breach of contract and systematic misconduct. She told them that Patricia Voss had been terminated for complicity in the suppression of legitimate employee complaints. She told them that an independent ethics review board was being established, effective the following Monday, staffed entirely by external practitioners with no existing relationship to Hartwell Capital. And she told them in the final paragraph, which she had rewritten 3 times, to get the register exactly right, that she was sorry. Not in the hollow, liability-conscious way that corporations apologize, burying the admission under qualifications and future tense promises. She wrote it the way her father would have written it. "These things happened in this company on my watch for years. I did not see them in time. I am sorry for that. I will spend the remainder of my tenure making sure this organization is worthy of the people who chose to build their careers here." The response was immediate and overwhelming. By 6 p.m., Sandra's office had received 41 emails from current employees describing experiences they had never formally reported. 7 of them referenced Brandon's department directly. 12 referenced other managers in other divisions, names that Sandra wrote down in her portfolio, with the careful attention of someone beginning a new chapter of a much larger project. Teresa Banks received Sandra's call at 4:38, while she was at her desk in the Brooklyn apartment she had moved into during the 11 months she spent in retail, an apartment she had stayed in afterward because the rent was manageable, and she had learned during those months not to commit to expenses she might not be able to sustain. Sandra laid it out plainly. Full reinstatement. 18 months of back pay calculated at the salary she would have received had she not been terminated with interest. Health benefits restored retroactively, covering the 4 months she had rationed her medication. Promotion to the senior director position, she had been denied the position that had been filled after her termination by a white male analyst with 18 months less experience and evaluation scores that did not approach hers. Teresa was quiet for a long moment after Sandra finished. "Is this real?" she said. "Yes," Sandra said. Another silence. "I need you to say it one more time." Sandra said it one more time. Teresa Banks pressed her hand over her mouth and looked at the ceiling of her Brooklyn apartment and breathed. Just breathed. The way a person breathes when something they had stopped allowing themselves to want has come back from the direction they had least expected it. "I want it to mean something," Teresa said finally when she could speak again. "For the next person. I don't want this to just be about me." "It won't be," Sandra said. "Ms. Reeves would like to discuss a new role with you if you're willing. Leading the employee advocacy office, making sure the next person has somewhere to go." Marcus Drew's article ran the following morning in a major national business publication. Words with full documentation and one on-record quote from Dominique, the only comment she gave to any outlet. "Power should protect people. When it doesn't, it isn't power. It's just cruelty with a title." The article was shared 40,000 times in the first 6 hours. Brandon's wrongful termination suit lasted 72 hours. His attorney filed it on Thursday morning, citing procedural violations and lack of due process, and withdrew it on Saturday afternoon after Sandra forwarded the compliance recording of Brandon's 2:47 p.m. call. "Kill it before it reaches the second level," along with a brief note indicating that the Department of Labor investigators had already been provided copies of all relevant materials. The suit was withdrawn without comment. The $2.1 million compensation fund was announced on Friday. Former employees who had been affected by Brandon's department could apply through an independent administrator. The process required no NDA, required no silence clause, required nothing except documentation of employment and a description of what had happened. By the end of the first week, 63 former employees had applied. 3 days after the termination, Dominique was in her office after hours, the city lights coming on below her in the early dark of an October evening, when her assistant knocked and left an envelope on her desk. Plain white. No return address. Her name written by hand on the front in careful, slightly uneven letters. She opened it after her assistant left. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten from someone who had never met her. She read it once. Then she set it down on her desk and looked out the window for a long time. The letter was 2 pages long. It had been written by a woman named Alicia Monroe, a junior financial analyst who had joined Hartwell Capital 14 months ago, fresh out of graduate school, 26 years old, arriving with the particular combination of ambition and anxiety that characterized most people at the beginning of something they had worked very hard to reach. Alicia had never been in Brandon's department. She had never filed a complaint or been retaliated against or had her performance scores altered at midnight on New Year's Eve. What had happened to her was quieter and in some ways harder to name, the kind of thing that doesn't produce a paper trail because it never rises to the level of a documented incident, that lives instead in the accumulation of small moments that each taken individually could be explained away. The way her ideas in team meetings were acknowledged with a brief nod, and then repeated minutes later by a senior colleague who received the credit. The way she had been told during her first performance review that she was very impressive for someone from her background, a phrase delivered with complete sincerity by someone who did not understand why it landed the way it did. The way she had looked around rooms during her first year and counted the way she had learned to count, and found herself at 1 or 0 or alone in a category that shouldn't have been a category at all. She had watched the video of the flight. She had read Dominique's company-wide email 3 times, and then she had sat down at her kitchen table and written a letter to a woman she had never spoken to in the careful, slightly uneven handwriting of someone who wrote by hand rarely and was being precise about it. She told Dominique that she had spent 14 months at Hartwell, wondering if she was good enough. Wondering if the doubt she felt about her own capabilities was accurate or manufactured. Wondering in the quietest and most honest part of herself whether the spaces she was trying to occupy were spaces she was actually supposed to be in. "Watching what you did this week," she wrote in the second-to-last paragraph, "I understood something I don't think I could have understood any other way. You built this. You built the building I walk into every morning. You built the company that pays my salary and gave me the opportunity I worked my whole life for, and someone looked at you and told you that you didn't belong. If they could be that wrong about you," she wrote, "then maybe the voice that tells me I don't belong is wrong about me too." Dominique read those 2 sentences again. Then she folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the inside pocket of her jacket close. She kept it there for a long time. The all-hands meeting happened on a Monday morning 3 weeks after the flight, in the largest conference room at Hartwell's Manhattan headquarters. 200 employees in person. Another 400 on video call from the other 7 offices. Sandra at one side of the room, James Whitfield at the other, both of them standing because all the chairs were taken. Dominique stood at the front without a podium or a slide deck or notes. She talked for 31 minutes. She talked about what had been found and what had been done. About the independent ethics board, now operational, staffed by 5 external practitioners who reported directly to the board and had full authority to investigate any complaint at any level of the organization. About the elimination of all silence clauses from settlement agreements retroactive to the founding of the company. About the open escalation path, a direct reporting channel to Dominique's office bypassing every layer of management available to every employee at every level. She talked about the compensation fund, about the 63 former employees who had already applied, about the administrator's process and the timeline for review. And then she said, "I'd like to introduce someone." Teresa Banks walked to the front of the room. She was wearing a navy blazer and the reading glasses she pushed up her nose when she was concentrating, and she walked to the front with the steady, unhurried movement of a woman who had learned during 11 months of retail work and rationed medication and ceilings she stared at in a Brooklyn apartment exactly how much she was worth. Sandra introduced her formally. Senior Director of Employee Advocacy, newly created position, reporting directly to the founder's office responsible for the design and implementation of Hartwell's new complaint infrastructure. The applause started before Sandra finished the sentence. It was not polite applause. It was not the measured professional applause of people responding appropriately to a workplace announcement. It was the applause of 200 people releasing something relief recognition, the particular emotion that has no clean name but lives in the chest and feels like a door finally opening that has been closed for a very long time. Teresa stood at the front of the room and accepted it without deflecting, without minimizing. She let it land. 3 weeks later, Dominique was at O'Hare again. Same terminal, same gate. Same simple black carry-on she had owned for 6 years. The same jacket, the same unhurried walk through the terminal that she had always taken because she had never wanted to forget what moving through the world like a regular person felt like. She was early. She found a seat near the window and opened her folder and began reviewing the next acquisition document, the highlighter behind her ear, the coffee on the seat beside her. At the gate counter, a young black woman in a business suit, early 30s laptop bag over one shoulder. The careful, composed expression of someone working hard to project more certainty than they felt was standing at the counter, while the gate agent processed the passenger beside her, talking past her as if she were not there. Dominique watched for a moment. Then she closed her folder. She stood. She walked to the counter and stood beside the young woman. And she said to the gate agent quietly and without aggression, without drama, with the simple, flat certainty of someone who knew exactly where they stood, "She was here before me." The gate agent looked up. The young woman turned. She looked at Dominique with an expression that moved through surprise and recognition, and something that came after both of those things. Something that took a moment to identify because it was not an emotion people expected to find at an airport gate on a Tuesday morning. It was the expression of someone being seen. Dominique smiled at her. Small. Real. "You belong here," she said quietly. "Don't let anyone make you forget that." She walked back to her seat. She picked up her highlighter. She went back to work. Dignity is not something that can be assigned to you by the people who underestimate you or taken away by them either. It is what remains when everything else has been stripped down. What Dominique Reeves showed us is not just a story about power revealed. It is a reminder that the way we treat people when we believe there are no consequences is the truest measure of who we are. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Tell me which moment hit hardest. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is your sign. Because the next story is already waiting, and it's one you will not want to come to late.